Hello and welcome to this chess game review entitled Learn from the Past. And today we feature chess legend Howard Staunton, who the modern day pieces are named after him, the Staunton pieces, which you should be familiar with. But today's game takes place in 1842, and Howard Staunton has the black pieces, and he is playing John Cochrane. And let's begin here. So this game starts with Cochrane playing e4. So he wants to play an attacking game, and Howard Staunton replies with c5. And so as this game took place in 1842, the Sicilian defense was probably not played as much back then. So that's what Howard Staunton plays here, c5, the Sicilian defense, which is a counter-attacking opening. It tries to prevent white from playing d4 immediately, although that is what Cochrane does. And so now we see the potential problem with this move, as it will allow black to capture this valuable central pawn with a pawn from the side. And now the queen will have to recapture to keep the material balance even. And normally, knight to f3 would be played first before this d4 pawn push by white. That way, instead of the queen recapturing, the knight could recapture. But now Cochrane must recapture with the queen, and it leaves the queen vulnerable to attack here in the center. Normally, you don't want to bring your queen out too early, or your opponent can start attacking it with the pieces as he does here. So Howard Staunton takes advantage of this, attacking the queen and forcing the queen to make a decision to retreat, which is what Cochrane does here. And now we see that black is a little bit ahead of white in piece development now. He has a piece out where white just has this pawn. So the game continues with e5 here, and it looks like the computer would have preferred black to just develop another piece and then have two pieces out, to none at that point. But Staunton replies with e5, taking a share of the center here, but it could leave this pawn backward here in the center, this d pawn. So the game continues with white developing bishop to c4, aiming at this f7 pawn, which could be a potential weakness in black's side of the board. And the bishop does a good job of helping control the center here. But it looks like the computer preferred a knight move. And usually you want to bring your knights out first before your bishops in the opening, because the knights are almost always good if you place them on c3 or f3. Whereas the bishop, you don't really know right away exactly where the best placement for these bishops would be. Maybe b5 would have been better, or even e2, a more defensive move. Anyway, the game continues with knight to f6, attacking this pawn. And instead of protecting the pawn, Cochrane plays knight to f3, which leaves this pawn unguarded. The computer preferred just knight to c3, protecting the pawn. So if black were to capture this pawn, in the game, bishop to c5 was played, which is an excellent move, although the computer prefers a capture of this unprotected pawn. So we could take a quick look at that. If knight takes e4, well, then there are different options here. Let's take a look. One of them could be to immediately capture this pawn with check. And then if the king recaptures, well, then we have queen to d5 with check, and the king would have to move. But then we have the queen recapturing. So here material would be even, but after d5, now the queen must retreat, and black will be able to develop a piece. And so perhaps Staunton did not want to play this. He wanted to keep his pieces on the board, and he played differently, of course. So another option after knight takes e4 could also be queen to d5 here. And this threatens a mate here on f7, but black would have the option of queen to a5 with check and attacking this queen. So then after queen captures, knight captures, knight captures the pawn on e5 here and protects the bishop at the same time. But then capture of the bishop and recapture here. So the players avoided this continuation, and instead they opted to just develop their pieces. So if we go back to this knight to f3 move, the pawn was not captured. Instead, bishop to c5. Staunton just continues development of his pieces. And normally that's a good thing to do in the opening, is to just try and get all your pieces out as quickly as possible, get your king castled to safety, and then develop your rooks to open or half open files. So now we see that black is ahead in development here, but the game continues with castling by both sides, and then white finally plays knight to c3 and protects this pawn. And so now the game continues with h6 by Staunton. So the computer says that's an excellent move. It prevents a pin on his knight here, but preferred as the best move according to the computer lines are d6, which would help get this light squared bishop developed, which is just trapped in by this pawn at this point. All right, so Cochrane responds with a3, a good move, although bishop to e3 is preferred here, which would attack this bishop and potentially allow black to recapture and double these pawns up in the center. If the f-pawn recaptures, of course, these pawns would be doubled, which can be a weakness, doubled pawns, although they would control a lot of squares in the center here. All right, so a3 was played, and then Staunton responds with a6, which is a good move, but once again, the computer prefers d6 to help get this light squared bishop out. And now we have Cochrane playing bishop to d5 here. And so the computer says this is an inaccuracy and prefers just developing the rook here to e1, because this bishop to d5 move allows the possible capture of this bishop, which would just give up the bishop pair. So now we have d6 being played. So instead of capturing the pawn right away, d6 is played, allowing this bishop finally to have room to develop. And now Cochrane, instead of allowing his bishop to get captured, he captures a knight here, voluntarily giving up his bishop pair. And this also, after the recapture, b takes c6, now we have a less valuable pawn on the side, moving in here to towards the center, capturing towards the center, and helps keep pieces out of this d5 square. Now the knight cannot jump up here and try and take control of the center. So I don't know. This sequence here seems to have just helped black out. So, Cochrane should have played something different instead of that. He should have avoided giving up his bishop pair and helping black get his side pawn moved in towards the center where it does more good. All right, so the game continues with knight to e1 now. So this knight retreats back, which will allow this f pawn to move forward, but the computer says that is a mistake, that bishop to e3 should have been played, which just develops a piece, attacks this bishop, threatening to capture and double pawns. If black were to capture, well then white would have doubled pawns, but they would help control a lot of squares in the center here. So in the game, knight to e1 was played, and then the game continues with knight to g4. And according to the computer, this is a miss. A better move would have been just to develop this rook to e8. But Staunton decides to press forward, trying to create some weaknesses or attacking chances on white's king side here. So h3 is played. And it looks like instead of that, the computer prefers knight to d6, attacking the bishop with the knight and guarding this f2 pawn. So, after this h3 move, here we have a retreat of this knight. But now to Staunton, who should have played something different. The computer prefers, instead of retreating with that knight, it looks like just capturing with the bishop would have been better. Now, normally, you don't want to give up a knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn, but in this position, it would have worked out a little bit better if that had happened, because after capture, the king would be forced to capture, and then we would have f5, which is a good move because the rook is lined up on this king. If the pawn were to capture, well then the rook would have an open line on the king. The rook could capture with check, or the bishop could develop here and capture, and then have a threatened discovered attack by this rook. But anyway, in the game, there was, after this h3 move, Staunton retreats his knight, and now we have king to h1, getting off of this diagonal by the bishop here, lined up on the king. But it says that that is a miss. Once again, knight to d3 should have been played, attacking this bishop and forcing black to respond to that. So after the king moves to h1, we have knight retreating back to h7, which this now allows the f-pawn to push forward. It will allow the knight to reposition to g5 and participate in attack in the future on the king side. So finally, white plays knight to d3, and we have a retreat. And here it looks like f4 would have been the best move, to just push this pawn forward, attack a more valuable central pawn with one of your side pawns. But knight to d3 is played, and the bishop retreats back here. Although the computer prefers pushing forward with the bishop to d4 and attacking this c3 knight, maybe threatening to double pawns, although white could just move his bishop possibly to c2 here. But in the game, after retreat of the bishop to a7, we have f4 being played, which is the best move, pushing the pawn in front of the rook, attacking this central e5 pawn. And now queen to h4 is played by Staunton. So he begins a threat here of possibly using his queen and light squared bishop to attack this h3 pawn. And if, in the game, queen to f3 is played in response to help guard this. If f takes instead of this queen move, if we had a capture here, thinking that if black recaptured, the knight could capture and go ahead a pawn here, we have this attack here. And if this happens, the bishop cannot be recaptured with g takes h3, because after queen captures h3, so if we had this, this would just lead to a mate here, because this bishop on a7 is keeping an eye on this escape square here. So in the game, after queen to h4, we have queen to f3 to help guard against this threat of the queen and bishop piling up and attacking the king side here. So next, f5 is played, the best move, pushing this pawn in front of the rook, giving the rook more room to operate, possibly allowing the rook to swing down to f6 and then over to g6 and help attack the king side. And the game continues with e takes f5 here. And then the bishop just recaptures. So now we have a blunder played by Cochrane. So if we look at the evaluation, the game is pretty even, but after this blunder here, it swings drastically in Staunton's favor. And this is pretty much a game-losing blunder. g4 is played, and it looks like best would have been bishop to d2. Instead of this pawn push, just develop the piece here, allow your rooks to protect each other. And so if we go back and just take a look at this bishop to d2 move, that would have kept the game pretty even. So instead, g4 was played, and then after this blunder, it looks pretty rough for Cochrane now. The best move is knight to g5, and of course that is what Staunton played, a brilliant move which attacks the queen. It puts pressure on this h-pawn, and if the knight were just to be captured by the pawn here, it could cause problems with f captures the knight on g5. Well, now we have bishop captures on d3 with a discovered attack by the rook on the queen, and the bishop is also threatening to capture this rook on f1. And so if queen were to recapture here, well, then we have rook captures with check, queen captures, and the other rook could swing over here to f8 and attack the queen. So where does the queen move? If the queen tries to move up here to help protect this pawn, which is also under attack by the queen on h4, well, now the queen can jump down to e1 with check. And if the king swings up to h2 to get out of check, well, then we just have rook to f2 here, which pins the queen to the king, and the queen would be lost for this rook here. And also, we have this bishop, which is pretty much pinned to the other rook over here. So it's just not looking too good for Cochrane if that were to be played out. But anyway, after g4, the game is pretty much lost, and it continued with the knight to g5 move. And of course, the knight cannot be captured, so queen to g2 is played to get out of the attack by this knight. But then the game continues with knight captures on h3, and queen to h2 is played to pin the knight to the unprotected queen. But the queen just moves out of the way, captures another pawn. And so, Staunton is just winning, and the final moves of the game continued with queen to g2, trying to trade off this attacking queen. The queen just moves back here, lining up on the king. And then now we have the queen moving back to h2 to help protect the king. And after e4, attacking this knight on d3, knight to e1 is played, but then bishop to g1. So this is an excellent move. The computer preferred just pushing pawns forward to d5 here, but this move immediately attacks the queen. And so after rook captures, instead of recapturing, which is not possible because then the queen would be captured here, instead we have knight to f2 with check here. And so the king must move up to g2 here. But now we have bishop to h3 check. And here Cochrane resigned the game. Further play may have commenced with possibly queen captures, but then we would have knight captures, and then after rook to f1, queen to g4, king to h1, knight to g5, and the knight is safe because if it were to be captured by the pawn, the rook would just capture the f1 rook. So after bishop to d2, queen to h3 check. Anyway, the game may have continued in this fashion, and Staunton would just be winning ahead with this extra queen here. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that interesting game with chess legend Howard Staunton, who I believe he was born in 1810. He played mostly in the 1800s. And Bobby Fischer had a high opinion of Howard Staunton. He was considered, probably an unofficial world champion in the early and mid 1800s. But then around maybe 1850 or so, Adolf Anderson played against Staunton and was probably a better player, especially tactically. Adolf Anderson was very strong. And then Staunton's reputation suffered a little bit after that, later in his career, when Paul Morphy, the best player in the world at that time, who was just defeating everybody, and he challenged Howard Staunton, but Howard Staunton kind of avoided playing against Morphy and never had a tournament or a match set up between the two. Although Morphy really wanted to play Staunton, we never got to see what would have happened. Morphy probably would have defeated him as Staunton was later in his career and not playing as well as he did when he was younger. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.